name is Craig McCall. I'm a filmmaker. I've recently completed a documentary called Cameraman, The Life and Work of Jack Cardiff. It's a feature-length documentary, independent, which has been in the cinema, and in the UK it's now out on DVD. This is my little plug, available on Amazon. It's for want of a better expression, a labour of love, but also it's a proper film about an Englishman called Jack Cardiff, who, as it says in the title, was a cameraman. Other terms are cinematographer or director of photography. Pretty much the same thing. It means they lit feature films, dramatic films. I mean, Jack worked on other things, but that's really what a cinematographer, director of photography, cameraman does. Like other filmmakers in the late 80s, early 90s, I got a break working in music videos, and EMI had a whole floor in central London, in Manchester Square, called PMI, Picture Music International, which was, they did everything from Pink Floyd live concerts right down to small videos for karaoke's. And I came in doing low-budget music videos, and in a big open-plan office, and it was a mixture of people. It was a really exciting place. It was like a mini studio, and there was an elderly gentleman in one day, older than we'd normally had in there, although we did have quite a mixture of people coming and going, so it wasn't that surprising. And I had a small hand-cranked 16mm camera called a Bolex, which is pretty common, especially if you're a film student, you'd be aware of them. A bit rarer now. And Jack knew the camera, and we started talking about it. And I didn't immediately know who he was, and then someone said, "Oh, that's the great British cameraman Jack Cardiff." Now, I have to say, I didn't immediately know all his films, but one film I did know from my childhood, which I could say right off the bat, was called A Matter of Life and Death, which I always remembered as a kid. It was one of those films, for me, that still does, seems to transcend time, with these court cases going on in heaven, with all these people from different backgrounds and periods of time. It's so fantastical, and I do think it's probably one of the more timeless films he ever worked on. Anyway, I remembered that, and I started chatting with him, and he'd been asked to come in and do a kind of hour length or a version of Vivaldi's Four Seasons for what was then Laserdisc, which seems a bit like ancient history now, but there was a thing called a Laserdisc. The Japanese commissioned it, and one of the things that caught my imagination, or that started my conversation with Jack, was that he was really keen to get going, and he hadn't got his budget yet. But he opened the paper one day, and it had snowed in Venice, in Italy, and it's such a beautiful image. And it doesn't snow in Venice; it's a very rare occasion, maybe once every couple decades. And Jack really wanted to get the image, and he didn't have his budget, so he basically got in a car, took the 16mm hand crank camera, and just went and shot it, just so he got that image, because he knew he couldn't wait for the budget. And what really struck me was he had this kind of enthusiasm and wonder that you'd think would be from a film student who just graduated.
Sure.
He was just so enamored by getting the image, and so alive and so aware of it. And years later, when I would interview other people like Kirk Douglas in my documentary, he would say he had the eyes of Chagall. Jack, even in his 80s, I mean, and he carried on working literally into his 90s. I've got him on set at 91 years old. It's incredible. There he is, lighting a scene at 91. I thought I wanted to tell Jack's story because he crossed over with all these. It wasn't just because he was a cameraman and he lived so long. He was there at key moments. And for example, he had shot a lot of the big screen icons: Marilyn Monroe, Audrey Hepburn, Sophia Loren. Yes, there was three other big elements with Jack which really kicked in. One is he loves to paint. So I had all his paintings and him painting. Two, he actually took these big screen icons, these actresses like Marilyn Monroe, offset and did his own portraits, which created another whole thing. And thirdly, he took a small 16mm camera on location on movies, so you get all these lovely behind the scenes goofing around fun stuff with whether it's John Wayne and Sophia Loren in North Africa. But one of the real gems in it is he took the camera on African Queen, which is still held up as one of the kind of classic movies. So I had all this beautiful, amazing, candid shots of John Huston and Katharine Hepburn and Humphrey Bogart on the making of African Queen. So Jack was a cinematographer, but I had all those other elements to edit together. Jack shot an amazing film called Black Narcissus, which he won an Oscar for in 1947, and it was about a group of nuns in the Himalayas and them going a little bit insane. And it was when it was shown in the States, it was so unusual seeing this type of Technicolor, and that's what really made Jack's name. You know, winning an Oscar then for this amazing movie, which was actually all shot at Pinewood Studios in England. You have to remember that when that film turned up, Black Narcissus was shown in America up till then. This is a generalization, but just to put it into context, Technicolor, to shoot a film in Technicolor was about 25%, 30% more. So it was a big chunk of money. And a lot of producers found it difficult to justify, or studios were not inclined. So mainly people were going to the cinemas, you'd have seen films, outdoor pictures like Westerns, because you could argue that spending that extra money would attract an audience to your Western rather than the rival's Western. And MGM would use it for musicals, not exclusively MGM, but it kind of seemed obvious to use color for the pageantry and the flair, which is a big component of how those films satisfy an audience. So then, and among this, can you imagine these films starting to come out of England about nuns isolated in a mountain, kind of suppressed sexuality, and then using color to heighten that story.
Look, turning to the films that we've got here at Time Image and the British Council films, this is obviously the time when Jack was experimenting with Technicolor, as you've been describing. How would you sort of contextualise these films in terms of his career?
Well, we've talked with two at the moment. We've talked about Colour and Clay and Border Weave. To put them into context, when people went to the cinemas in the 40s, into the 50s, before TV really kicked in, you didn't just watch a theatrical feature, a drama film, you got a short. But what people forget is you also got a newsreel, maybe a little travelogue film. It was a whole list of movies. It was a whole itinerary of films that you got. So, you know, you would watch a news, Pathé News, you'd see what was happening in Europe, or you'd see what was happening. And people wanted to use colour to show things off. So they might seem a little bit simplistic and naive to us today, but they were just showing different things in colours. So you'd see the Scottish Highlands, or cloth being weaved, but in colour. Because most things were reproduced in monochrome then. All photography was black and white. And so reproductions, so the world was art, or paintings were in colour, but all reproductions were predominantly monochrome. So colour really was unusual, and people wanted to apply it to attract attention. You were fighting for people's attention, so you wanted to stand out. All news footage would have been in black and white, so colour was used for these little set-piece films. Jack had done World Windows, and what they had been was, in the 30s, Jack had gone off and made films in Egypt. He'd gone all the way to India and shot Taj Mahal, or he had shot temples to gods like Nandi the bull. I mean, you have to remember, most people had never been abroad, and then the war, other people went abroad. So these were the only colour images, particularly moving images, they were ever going to see. And so, again, as I say, it might seem a little bit naive and simplistic to us, but I like watching them, and I think they're important because they encapsulate a time, but they give you a feel, there's the language of it. And if you just think about Jack's component, the photography, even if the voiceover is very much a BBC branding, or a Pathé branding, or an American news branding, the images are a separate thing. And so, even though you could watch 5 films about Scotland or the Highlands from that time, they might all view it in a different way. Yeah. So you're getting a different view of history at that time, and because of such cultural the cracking open because of the Second World War and the resetting of Europe and the whole world to fact. Some good things came out of that artistically. People were looking things to escape from the newsreels of the horror of what was going on in the world and the carnage. People really needed other things, particularly after the war. I mean, after so many millions of people dying, people needed other things. It wasn't just pure escapism. It was just a way of looking at the world and being positive. Even if it was just saying, here's the new steel industry in Sheffield, here's a new machine for pottery. It was positive, and people wanted to feel good about. It was a brave new world, really, and film was definitely becoming and being used in evolving quite rapidly. Let's put it that way. Coming out of new reel. I mean, then it was competing with TV. Then you get the 50s, just to put it into the final bit of this context. Technicolor had a beautiful run, and then Kodak brought in, because Technicolor was 3 strips of film, black and white films, and the color was split. By 1950s, Kodak had come in with Kodachrome, and that was it. It was the end of Technicolor. Pretty much ended as an entity. The lab carried on, and so you still always had the Technicolor brand, but it ended, and more and more films started to be shot in color. And eventually, by the 60s, by the end of the 60s, all film black and white was seen as something low, cheap, and down, and that's how it moved. Just as a little historical note, there were always 2 Oscars for cinematography for about 30 years. They ran in parallel. There was one for black and white and one for color. And that ended, I think, around the late 60s. So that's the kind of context that Jack was making the films that you might see on your website. What I would say to other people looking to make films, documentary films, narrative films, animated films, short films, if I was one word, be persistent.
Sure.
The original title of the documentary was Persistence of Vision. I thought it was a little bit awkward title, a little bit obtuse, so I thought Cameraman, Life and Work of Jack Cardiff, simplistic, prosaic, but gets to the point. I think be persistent. And I can sound a little bit preachy here, but I think a lot of people think, well, I've done a course, I'm waiting around, I'll do a film now. It doesn't work like that. You need to develop people's skills. You can't get out there. The other thing I'd say, get out there. Do not sit at home. I don't care that you know Final Cut Pro, and I don't care that you know the Red Camera. They're all going to be gone. There'll be something else in 2 years. I began on film. You work on HD. The boxes don't matter. What you can't teach, I can teach anybody how to use a camera. What you can't teach is perception. That's yours. It's your strength and your weakness, because it's your point of view of the world. That's how you'll do that scene. And even though the cost of equipment's come right down, getting a scene in the can on a Sunday morning with a group of people, the skills haven't altered. And those are what people need to do. And be very persistent. There's lots of talented people who are not persistent. They will not succeed.
Yeah. That's
the one thing that you can be. And try and have wide reference points. That's going back to your website and the films on there. It's great watching those. I might take an idea from one of those little short films with a clay pot being done and end up using that in a movie. And it's great. And one of the things is to almost with the internet and having open source material is how you also need to make a little bit of time to look at different things. One of the things I also say, which I say is, I'll see an actor in a film, and then I'll start. So in one of Jack's films, there's a chap called Edmund O'Brien. Now he's in a film, The Barefoot Contessa, but he's also in The Wild Bunch. And I thought, well, what did he do between The Barefoot Contessa and The Wild Bunch? And by going through it, of course, out of every 5 films, one's pretty crappy, one will be a really famous one, and there'll be 3 in between you never heard of. And it's great. I say, take an actor. I was saying to somebody the other day, somebody I knew had worked with Viggo Mortensen. So he's done films with David Cronenberg, but he's also in Lord of the Rings. If you just take Viggo Mortensen's career, but watch them all. Go through all of them. Take an actor, take a composer, and be persistent, develop lots of relationships, and you better make damn sure you want to do it, because there's a lot of people out there trying to do the same thing.